Hi, this is Sumaya Kamani and Hilary LeBlanc, and you're listening to Off the Rack, where we explore the evolution of fashion, its history, trends, and the stories shaping its future.
We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples.
This is Hilary.
And this is Samaya. Welcome to season 1 of Behind the Scenes, where we talk about the evolution of Canadian fashion. So this week we'll be speaking with David Cash. David Cash is acclaimed for award-winning innovations via his agency Cash Labs. Cash expertly navigates Fortune 500 initiatives across XR, AI, and Web3 technologies, having produced globally witnessed activations seen by billions. Cash Labs has been lauded as the leading force behind Web3 endeavors to market and recently won the Innovations Award at the 10th Annual Canadian Arts and Fashion Awards.
So absolutely amazing.
How are you doing, David? And tell us a little bit about Cash Labs.
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. So yeah, like you just mentioned, I run an agency called Cash Labs. We were born a little bit under 3 years ago, about two years, 7 months, if we're being specific. Cash Labs came out of necessity, came into being out of necessity, I can say. I wrote a master's thesis on the topic of NFTs and how to use, digital on-chain assets for businesses and for the fashion industry and for the music industry, and how do we apply this technology into culture in 2020. And I didn't really think anything of it. I previously ran a production company for about 7 years, and that was all I really thought of doing for a majority of my life, up until the pandemic, when everything really changed. I can go into more detail on this as well, but pandemic, everything changed for a lot of people. Previously, I was working like 300 days out of the year on sets, and all of a sudden I wasn't able to do that. And so I ended up going back to school, and one thing led to another. I went down a really, really deep rabbit hole, and I ended up learning about NFTs and having a bit of an epiphany and realizing that I could use this technology to my advantage. Started writing about it, and yeah, I released that thesis in 2020. I put it out on the internet, and lo and behold, at first it was I got like 1,000 emails and I didn't really know what was going on. And then all of a sudden I started looking at the little Bitly tracker of how many people had read it, and it kept climbing like 100,000, 500,000, a million people. And this little document that I just put out on the internet, again, not thinking very much of it, kind of went viral in this moment. And so that's when I started Cash Labs, not because I thought to start Cash Labs, but because I was receiving at one point 10,000 emails a week from people reaching out to me asking, how do we use technologies to our advantage? We've read your paper about how you pitch 20, 30, 40 different concepts of how this could work in, the entertainment industry, which is evidently where you come from. Help us. And, that initially started with me working with people that you might expect, within the tech industry, like venture capital funds or tech companies or, an NFT marketplace. Of course, the kid who wrote about NFTs is going to work with an NFT marketplace, no surprise there. But very quickly, that developed and, evolved into us working with bigger and bigger people. And for the first year or so of Cash Labs existence, I call it, our drinking from the water hose phase, because realistically, we were just taking in all of this information and just trying to process it. So first, like I mentioned, it was, VCs or, tech companies who were asking us to help them speak about this technology they were working with, because we were one of the only people who had published an academic document. By we, at that point, I mean me. Now I speak about Cash Labs in the pejorative, but at that point, it was literally just me, writing and creating content about, Web3 tech. And very quickly, like I mentioned, that evolved into us working with some of the biggest artists in the world who were, taking advantage of this tech. And then those artists were working with some of the biggest galleries and some of the biggest celebrities in the world. So, very synergistically and, just through a kind of flow process, one project would lead to another project, which would lead to another project. It went from us doing, projects with people like Krista Kim, who are some of the leading NFT artists in the world, to very quickly doing projects with people like Paris Hilton or Deadmau5, kind of moving into the more traditional celebrity space. And then that, quickly evolved into us working with even larger organizations like the NBA or like Verizon. And, that just kept kind of spitballing and growing. And, again, we were drinking from the fire hose for quite some time, up until fall of 2021. I was in Miami doing a bunch of activations at Art Basel, and I had a breakfast with the people at Decentraland. And Decentraland is a metaverse platform. They're a virtual world. And I was talking to these folks, and we'd previously done some activations. I brought Paris Hilton. We did an activation with Paris Hilton in Decentraland. I brought Deadmau5 to their Metaverse Music Week. We did a main stage performance in a virtual space with Deadmau5. It was very cool. And they were asking me, I have a background in fashion and production, and they were asking me, what does a fashion event look like in the metaverse? And I got really excited because actually during the pandemic, before I went to school, I'd produced with the folks at Fashion Art Toronto a digital fashion week. And to my knowledge, and at that time, we were talking about it as the first ever digital fashion week. But that meant something very different to us then. Then that meant, we're just going to film models on cameras and post that on the internet. It didn't mean we were going to, use avatars and create, completely fabricated fashion shows from scratch using, 3D or CGI or, the metaverse. It wasn't the conversation at the time. But that's really what we did. And it started with a breakfast. I left that breakfast as the curator of Metaverse Fashion Week. And we took about 3 or 4 months to speak to hundreds of different brands and press outlets and institutions around the world. And we created an event with over 80 different brands, including people like Dolce & Gabbana, Etro, Elie Saab, some of the leading brands in the world. It was a very, night and day experience. One day I was like sitting there in my pajamas having like, a 16-hour day of calls. And then the next day I'm getting an email from Vanessa Friedman from the New York Times asking me to meet with her and talk about fashion in the metaverse. So it was a very strange period of my life. That event went on to be seen by over 1.2 billion unique people. The event got over 8 billion impressions overall. We had over 150,000 live attendees at the shows from all over the world. We had people writing about this in over a dozen languages, from Japanese to you name it. And, it was a really intense and transformative experience for me in a lot of different ways. But the reason I'm going into detail on this is it changed a lot of what I do and how I look at this space, because, I got to work very directly with brands who I think did a really good job of harnessing technology and integrating it into their brands in an effective way that actually, reached consumers and people understood. And then I also saw brands who, looked at this nascent technology and this new community and really just tried to take advantage of it to a certain extent. And I am choosing those words specifically. But, how do they harness that community? How do they use that community to their advantage? How do they break into a new market? And I, while that is valuable, I kind of started looking at that as maybe the negative in the equation. And I really started gravitating towards the brands who are trying to use technology to their advantage, to their brand's advantage, to their consumers' advantage, to try to create better experiences for their consumers, selling them things that they already want and not trying to force something down their throat, which was, after working in the Web3 space for about a year and a half, selling a ton of different NFT projects and these types of things. A lot of the things that we were doing were very culturally relevant, but you do still start to feel, that I'm shilling, I'm trying to sell people something that maybe they didn't ask for, right? And so when we started working with these larger brands, like for instance, in the first Metaverse Fashion Week, we had the pleasure of working with Estee Lauder company, Estee Lauder Global, and we produced a beautiful activation for them. And that was, I always mention it because that was a perfect example of a brand that created an activation for their consumers. And it showed in the numbers. I mean, like I said, we had 1.2 billion unique impressions. 900 million of those people checked out the Estee Lauder activation. They maxed out all of their stats in terms of people claiming their free, gifts in the metaverse. And, they had amazing numbers across the board. And brands like that, really taught us a great lesson in terms of how brands can work with these new technologies in a way that is relevant to their consumers and to their audiences. And, they did comms in over a dozen different languages and really onboarded their community into this experience by giving them something that they already wanted and were interested in. So that very much shifted the paradigm of how we look at this whole industry and what we do. And since then, we've been really focused, we as in Cash Labs, and I do mean that as we, since then we have grown significantly. We've been really focused on taking these types of companies, these culturally relevant, pervasive brands across industries and trying to work with them to integrate and develop experiences, initiatives, projects, programs, apps, that, really take advantage of the best of the 2024 tech suite, the best of what we have today, and use it to their consumers' advantages. And having worked with so many new technologies like NFTs, producing this first Metaverse Fashion Week, which now there have been multiple iterations of, we've learned how to help people go from point A to point B of understanding and integrating a new technology into their business. So while the world continues to move at breakneck speed and technology continues to develop every single day, AI is now the buzzword that everybody's speaking about, even though last year nobody would mention it. Or when I brought up AI in a meeting, they'd be like, oh, we don't want bots. That's not something we're interested in. The space moves very quickly. And what we're developing a skill set in is really how to harness transformative technologies and integrate them into companies and into culture. And so I give you this whole long spiel just because what we do is kind of complicated and a little bit specific, but I can boil down all of the different things that we've done from game activations to website optimizations into 2 categories. So right now, Cash Labs does 2 things. Our 3-year evolution has come here. And now we focus on what we call digital transformation. So we work with a lot of these brands, like the brands I'm describing. Some of our biggest clients are some of the largest Fortune 500s in the world. Folks like Farfetch, again, like I mentioned, NBA, Verizon, et cetera. And we work with these types of brands on integrating technologies into their business and transforming their business digitally. So this can mean anything from us producing a virtual world for one of these brands, or it might mean that we're updating their website, which hasn't been updated since 1995, and integrating it with the latest and greatest tech that exists now to improve their process, save time, save money, make their lives better. So that's one side of our business. And then the other side of the business, is really from me working with so many new technologies and so many purveyors of new technologies. We've had the pleasure of working with hundreds of startups at this point who have, provided solutions for various clients of ours. And we're really diving in on that level too and focusing on supporting transformative or infrastructure layer tech companies with their communications and how do they speak about these things that they're creating, these innovations that they're bringing to market, where previously that conversation very much only happened between venture capital funds, like I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, full circle, and those tech companies. We now want to bring that conversation into the conversation that consumers and brands are having so that we can actually use these technologies and these applications of technologies to people's advantage and not just have them sit in a silo or, exist in this kind of bubble where nobody gets to experience or use them. So that's really what I'm all about. And that's what I really care about. I'm really, really passionate about trying to bridge the intersection between culture and technology. I'm going to fix my light in a moment. This really stretches across the board into all the things that I do. So that's Cash Labs. Like you mentioned, we've won some awards. We've had lovely people like Vogue say really nice things about us. But I try to stress that into all the different things that I do. So I mentor for a number of different organizations, working with these infrastructure layer startups, trying to help them, take their ideas from concept to reality. I teach a guest lecture at a bunch of different universities, again, trying to help folks and younger people especially actually understand what we're dealing with here and how this is all going to continue to change so quickly. Also write. I'm a columnist, a tech columnist for Vogue Singapore, and I write for a few other organizations, helping them speak about and contextualize all this stuff that we do. So that's my long introductory spiel, and hopefully that wasn't that was
incredible. That was incredible. I'm floored, but I will say a little bit of backstory that I did know of you during the first Fashion Art Toronto Digital Fashion Week. It was told to me by attending Fashion Art Toronto that I was around basically Fashion Art Toronto fame when we first met. And I was at the after party when you won the CAFA, when we were first introduced. I believe you were wearing some beautiful Lumistrano that evening. I think that's the year that you won. Yes. So, congratulations on, first of all of this success. And I'm definitely going to get more into the weeds later on in the questions about as someone, I did some mild coding back in the day, but this is still a bit in the clouds, lost on me. But getting to our first question is more just around, tech and fashion as these two constructs. How does technology right now currently influence Canadian fashion? And what trends do you think we'll see in the future, since I think your whole mandate is sort of looking ahead to the future, which is very cool.
Absolutely. And that's a really, really good question. I think I look at this from a couple different ways. Usually when I'm asked this question or a variety of this question, it's either coming from a brand or it's me posing it to a brand. And what I'm usually after when I'm asking this question is, I'll ask a designer, give me a list of all the touch points where people experience your brand today. And then try to make 2 columns and divide those into in real life or physical and URL or digital. And the amount of designers that really struggle to put even one example of physical in that column is staggering, especially younger designers. Like when you think, if you're a designer in university or you're somebody who didn't do a fashion school program, when have you done a runway show? Unless you have your own funding or somebody helped you out or you happen to be friends with somebody, when have you done a runway show? When have you exhibited your clothes in a showroom? Some people can say yes, some people can say they haven't. But I don't think anybody who would consider themselves a designer today would not have an Instagram, a website, a Pinterest. You know, a lot of the time today, the first thought that we have when we consider how we would experience or witness fashion in our day-to-day lives, maybe not in a grander context like a fashion week, is digital. And I think that it's important for brands to wrap their minds around that. Many do. You know, many brands have entire departments, if not companies, that focus solely on their e-commerce verticals. Like I've mentioned, we've had the pleasure of working with many e-commerce leaders in the world, such as Farfetch. And these are massive companies. You know, these are companies worth and spending and allocating billions of dollars a year on digital strategy and digital marketing, implementation, sales, etc. So I think, not to answer your question with a question, but my response is typically, you know, how are we not experiencing fashion digitally today? I think that for the average consumer, or for most people, the way that you are witnessing clothing on the same level, if we're thinking on a consumer level, that the way that you're witnessing or experiencing clothing from a brand like Gucci, Fendi, Prada, Dolce & Gabbana, Balmain, insert brand here, is digital. You're watching their live stream on Instagram. You're going to their website and you're checking out their e-commerce platform. You're getting ads from them across all of your social media. And that's just considering the open web. That's just considering like Web 2 websites and socials. Like we're not even thinking beyond that in terms of when you go into many stores today, they will have screens. Some of those screens are just digital screens with advertisements on them or videos, which wasn't a thing 15, 20 years ago. But other screens will actually be interactive. You'll be able to walk up to a screen. We've seen brands like Coach, Diesel, Boss, like major global brands integrate AR mirrors or in some way digitally augmented mirrors into their stores. And this is something that we're starting to see more and more, especially in things like malls. You know, you're starting to see these like flagship type activations. And again, this is really thinking baseline. Like nothing that I've mentioned so far, I would consider an innovative example of technology from my perspective. Maybe AR mirrors in store. Okay, that's still kind of nascent. But generally speaking, like a website or social media, we're all on that page already. And then when you start thinking that a lot of these brands are already starting to invest into what the future of this digital economy is going to look like. So by that, I'm including things like video games, things like the metaverse as a concept, going deeper into AR, or considering how do their assets live digitally beyond just you know, a 3D scan or an image or a video. Then you're really starting to move into, again, thinking a little bit more mainstream. Fun fact, any watch brand that you would consider luxury, probably, like if you look at an advertisement by them, especially a video advertisement, the likelihood that there is a single second in that ad that shows you an actual real watch is highly unlikely. Most, if not all, of those ads are 100% fabricated CGI, 100%. If you ever see in a commercial a watch or a piece of clothing fly apart and then come back together, I can promise you not a single dial ounce fabric piece on that garment or on that accessory is real, as in IRL, as in, you know, physical. So I think when we start considering the digitization of assets, that's when we kind of open up a whole new world, because we can consider how we perceive assets through digital platforms like social media, and the idea that we may not even know if something's real or digital, which doesn't really matter when we're creating content or creating something creative for people to look at. But then when we start pushing beyond that, we can consider things like there's over 3 billion people today who played a video game. So what are all of those 3 billion people wearing in all of those video games? Guess what? It's digital fashion. I don't care if you're an orc in Lord of the Rings or a killer in Call of Duty or an assassin in Assassin's Creed in Venice. I don't care. You're wearing clothes on your avatar, or maybe you're not. I mean, but that's a conscious choice. And though a lot of brands are taking advantage of these types of contexts. And again, that's not even talking about what I hope to be a piece of this conversation, which is what everybody's seeing in the media right now around Apple's Vision Pro, Meta's XR headset, their Quest 3, or considering what a spatial environment would look like when we start taking these 3D assets and we go beyond thinking of them as an Instagram filter, or we go beyond thinking of them as something you could use in a video game or see in a commercial. But what if these 3D assets were actually things we could interact with directly in our immediate environment? So, I mean, it's a huge question and it's really broad. And also, I think that there's a lot of different aspects of how technology intersects with fashion today, specifically because the fashion industry is inherently, and I'll end with this for this question, the fashion industry is inherently a walled garden. And by that, I mean, there is an inherent aesthetic distance to the fashion industry as a whole. A brand does not want you to necessarily know how they made their garments unless it's extremely impressive. Think Chanel, documenting the heritage process of every little stitch that goes into their garment. But generally speaking, there is this aesthetic distance, this, oh, you wouldn't understand. Like, no, like it's a couture dress. We've made it perfectly. Like, this is for us to do and you to understand, you're the consumer, you should appreciate this. But I think when we're starting to move into a digital space, the same kind of thing comes up again, where brands are starting to, let's create an experience for them that they may not fully understand. But I think that's wrong. I really do believe that the next generation of consumers really do care about understanding what they're doing, how they're consuming products, how that product functions. And, to facilitate this type of future, this level of transparency, this veil has to lift at some point. And I really do believe now that we're moving into this digital first, from my perspective, environment in terms of how we interact with fashion, we're going to start to see that veil lifted. And I'm mentioning that because in the fashion industry, there's in front of the camera, you can say, so like what we're actually sharing with the consumer, and then there's behind the camera, there's production, manufacturing, e-commerce, logistics, operations, etc. What does it mean to run a global business today in often 50 plus countries, dealing with everything from privacy and security through to shipping and logistics? It's a very complicated industry, and there's so many opportunities throughout that process for technology to play a role in optimizing, improving, automating, supporting. So I won't even dive into that immediately, but I'd say there's an infinite amount of ways that I think technology today is supporting.
Yeah, and I feel you hit the nail on the head with this one, because the world, especially with this generation, is moving towards this technology. They're moving towards AI, especially. It's existed for a while, but it's only gained popularity with the origin of ChatGPT, or with the Facebook announcing their new strategies with Metaverse. So I think it existed for a while, but it gained popularity around that time. But now that it has, every company is trying to incorporate those technologies into their businesses. Some are profitable, some might not be, like Lululemon. When they introduced their mirror technology, it probably wasn't that profitable, which is why they're moving towards dissolving that. But that's where everybody's trying to get their hands dirty, because they want to incorporate technology in some aspects of it. So my next question is kind of asks about how you think technology is being used in different ways, whether it's in production or the marketing side of things, or how the way it's consumed today, or where do you think in terms of the trends as they're going, or the demand or expectations, where do you think that's going?
I'd like to just add to that you mentioned very quickly, what you think of innovation versus what the consumer might think of as innovative in terms of the wall. So I'd love to hear, in that realm of, what is shaping fashion, whether it's all of those things, what is innovation to you then in those sectors?
Yeah, great questions. I think when we look at brands, the larger the brand, the higher the likelihood that brand will actually have an innovation department. And I think it's interesting, I had a few conversations with some large brands today, and sometimes, within that innovation department, you'll have a vertical that runs gaming. You'll have a vertical that runs Web3. You'll have a vertical that runs in-store. You'll have a vertical that runs e-commerce. And it really shows you how multifaceted, the concept of innovation, especially within the fashion industry or within entertainment, is today. And Sumaya, you touched on something that I'm going to bring up again, which is like, when a brand tests something in a nascent phase of technology, sometimes it's not successful because, a lot of times brands are experimenting with technology. And I would say, per your question, Hillary, a lot of the time when it's considered an experiment for the brand specifically, that's when this would be within the purview of innovation or under their innovation department, whatever that looks like. If they've never done it before, if they don't have enough proven use cases at a publicly traded level, at a Fortune 500 level, let's say, of this being done successfully. Like if I, Cash Labs, come to them with case studies and I have 25 live examples of something working, they probably don't need to do as extensive a level of research as they would otherwise. If I'm coming to them with something that they've never done before and no other major fashion brand has ever done before, that's going to require a group of people who have some kind of experience implementing or speaking about or, integrating a new technology. So that I would put under the umbrella of innovation. But what I was going to mention is when you think about the life cycle of a lot of these things, Sumaya, you mentioned that Meta and the announcement of Meta instead of Facebook and the metaverse, really did spark this wave of interest into the space, and that's completely correct. I was personally extremely lucky and got a ton of interest out of this, and I have done many interviews. I did many interviews in that period of time, specifically speaking about that. And I was also super lucky because Metaverse Fashion Week was announced 3 months after that happened. So we really got to ride that wave to a certain extent. But also when you consider that was 2021, right? That was fall of 2021. The term metaverse was coined by Neil Stephenson in the 80s. He published a book in 1992 called Snow Crash. And that's the first time that the metaverse as a public concept was put out there as this like one cohesive digital world that was, comprised of all these, individual virtual worlds. That was a long time ago. It took almost 30 years for that term to come into existence, or in so far as how we consider it today, and then for it to actually take effect at a mass market level. And you can obviously argue that we've been, living in, to a certain extent, a virtual space or a metaverse for quite some time, since the 90s, since the advent of the internet, when many of us joke all the time about how we spend 8 to 10 hours plus on our phone every day. How is that not spending time in a digital environment? But I think when you start to consider trends within their life cycles, something like AR, like you mentioned, these AR mirrors, is still in its early stages. AR has been around for quite some time. We've seen Snapchat and Instagram be playing around with AR for a decade plus, I'm going to say, not checking the dates specifically. But we haven't necessarily seen that technology go the full way yet. I don't think any of us would say that all the AR filters on our phone are beautiful or high end or high quality. But, brands are still experimenting with this. There's brands like Tiffany & Co. who publicly have over 1,000 AR filters of their jewelry because they love the idea of digital try-on. We see brands like Sephora really deeply integrate something like digital try-on into their app because it works and it makes sense, especially for something like lipstick that's not so fidelity driven, or it's just one shade in one context. That's something that's very applicable and can actually work in a mass market context. Like you're saying, an AR mirrors as we know them today are really kind of like a growth hack of live technology. Essentially what you're seeing when you see an AR mirror in a store is a big TV, a webcam, and the UI UX of an iPhone or the Snapchat app. And also 90%, maybe I won't say 90% anymore because there's one really big company, 010, that's been doing a really great job of this. Let's say 75 to 80% of the examples of AR mirrors that you've seen are using an API that's free from Snapchat that was released 5 years ago. So we're really not looking at the latest, greatest, best technology most of the time when we're looking at an AR mirror. And I will make the add in my 2 cents. Just nobody will necessarily care about this, but if you are interested in seeing somebody who's developed proprietary tech in that regard, 010, 0 and then the number 10, they're a company out of New York and they do a great job at creating a proprietary system that provides the same thing. And they've done stuff for Coach and all these big brands. But yeah, all of this to say, when we're looking at a technology, especially like something like the blockchain or AI or, AR or XR, hopefully per some of today's conversation, moving towards this Vision Pro future, what is spatial computing? What is all this? We've all seen these ads now. We really have to consider that the fidelity, and by that I mean the look and the quality of the assets that we're seeing within something like an AR context is nothing compared to what's possible. I'll compare that quickly towards if anybody listening or you guys have seen this CGI Matrix movie that was made with Unreal Engine 5, where Keanu Reeves' avatar looks photorealistic, and like you really couldn't tell that it's not him unless you really squinted or saw some very, very detailed shot that was maybe a little bit of an uncanny valley moment. But we do have the ability, and also, like I mentioned, these watch commercials where you actually can't tell if it's real or if it's not. We do have the ability to create 3D assets at that level, at that meta-human level. You know, there's people who spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on creating a digital version of themselves that's almost indistinguishable, but we can't necessarily take that creative and apply it in a context like AR at its full capacity yet. So I think that's kind of that distinction of where we're at right now. A lot of the time also per like, has the brand done this or not? If it fits, if it falls within that like developing technology vertical, they'll also put that within the innovation category. But it is debated and it is quite broad. I would say the only pieces that we see consistently across the board right now with every innovation department, they're interested in extended reality or augmented reality. They're interested in gaming and or virtual worlds in the metaverse. They're interested in blockchain technology, not even necessarily NFTs anymore. And every single one of them is interested in AI. And actually, the last
would you say then this is the AI technology or technology in general is moving too fast or too slow? Because obviously there are many issues of ethics, or we don't even know what's true or what's not. So like you said, the Keanu Reeves example that you gave, we don't even know what's true or what's not. And people are using it in advertisements, marketing, promotion campaigns, political campaigns. So would you say it's moving too fast in fashion, or do you think that the demand is exceeding the supply?
Well, I think AI is a really great example of a technology that has now become culturally pervasive, but in a very, very specific use case. So AI as a concept has been developed for longer than a lot of the conversations that we've been talking about have been developed. You know, where like it existed as a concept before the metaverse existed as a concept. You know, I have people on my team who've been working with AI tech for 15 plus years. But the current iteration and the current global popularity of AI, I think, is more the thing that's really pushing this fear and this conversation into the forefront. I think that we really do have to consider things in the grander scheme. Also considering that, I don't think it was as much of an issue of us as a society maybe not understanding AI technology and what it can do. I think it's more an issue of culture and technology not being able to intersect or communicate for a very, very long time. And all of the applications of AI tech that we saw up until honestly last year, with exceptions, obviously, were for the most part created with the intention to hack or to optimize, but not necessarily legally or by the approved methods. And what I mean by that is most instances of AI that we saw in the past 10 years have been to some extent bots or mass messaging or going around a system or, like you said, creating a deep fake. So I think to the same extent that crypto has a bad rap to a certain extent around, like, a lot of people have done bad things with it, AI is also getting this bad rap because a lot of people are doing bad things with it. AI maybe has this better cultural understanding, I can say, because so many people have also done great things with it. And there's so many examples, and ChatGPT, for instance, has made it so easy for anybody to use aspects of the world that is AI to their advantage in their everyday lives really easily. And I think that's more the thing that is pushing this wave forwards than the technology itself. And the one thing I'll say on this, as a concept as well, when we're thinking about technology developing too quickly, I don't like to use the word too, because we can always say it's developing too quickly, but the rate of technological development is inherently exponential. So from its inception, technology will continue to develop and it will never, ever slow down. But that's just how innovation works across the board. The first person to make a wheel is not going to make a wheel, and then the next person's going to turn it into a square, and it doesn't work. They're going to continue to innovate and push forwards, right? So to the same extent, this technology is going to continue to move forward. So anytime I speak about the rapid development of technology, I'm actually writing a book about this right now. I talk about the concept of hypermodernity. And that's a big, weird, scary word to describe a big, weird, scary concept. But essentially, hypermodernity, or the idea of being hypermodern, is the phenomenon that technology is moving at a rate which makes it difficult for us to understand. That's what that is. And that is true. That is inherently true. And that will continue to prove more true as technology continues to develop. Because where in the at the dawn of the 1900s, at the turn of the century, I could see a horse and buggy and then consider, okay, maybe one day that horse and buggy wouldn't need a horse. Ooh, that could be cool. And that's a very small logic leap to make. But now moving from, okay, I have a landline telephone to now my telephone is something I carry around with me in my hand and needs to be charged once a day, to then my telephone lives on my face as a pair of goggles and I have to tap the air to interact. Like, it's a huge set of logic leaps that we're asking people to make. And that is more why, from my perspective, we have this whole boomer, gen everybody, paradigm, and why a lot of us fear technology, because we're looking at the negative sides of it, and the inherent rate of its growth, or the exponential rate of its growth, is scary because it's difficult for us to understand.
Absolutely. And we are going to get more into that, but I think that might be a little bit why I hear all these things and I'm like, remember a flip phone? I miss my Motorola Razr, I think a little.
I remember being so excited to get a Motorola Razr. I don't think I've ever been more excited to get a phone.
I was so excited, and then it played music from the touch screen in the front in the middle of class, and I got yelled at for being on my phone, even though it did it in my pocket, and felt shame forever.
I have one word. I really got excited by the commercial, and I tried throwing it into a wall. It didn't work. It did not work.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it broke.
That's hilarious. So I feel like we've talked a lot about, obviously, these really big brands that have a lot of capital that can do a lot of these things. And not to say there are Canadian brands that can't, but when we talk about the landscape of Canadian fashion, I do think, we've had the pleasure at this point in the podcast of going and looking at some 19th century textile and visiting the Royal Ontario Museum. We've talked to, brands that are using digital space to allow for, less waste to go to landfills by allowing digital try on. We've also, started to realize some things about funding and how that's so hard to get in the Canadian landscape. And when I think about Canadian bigger brands that might be able to achieve some of this, amazing tech feat, I do think of, the Lululemons, the Aritzias of the world. So I'm curious what challenges and opportunities that you see arise within Canadian fashion specifically as they try to either integrate these things or potentially are so small that they're not able to get there. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think that's an excellent question. Two things I'll mention on this. One of them is, considering how digital our lives are today, I firmly believe that all of this tech is made for small designers and emerging artists and people who can do things on their own. I mean, one of the first things that attracted me to Web3, for instance, and how I broke into this whole innovation space was my background as a director, as a photographer, thinking that, instead of a platform like Facebook or Google owning my content and monetizing it on my behalf and giving me a very, very small revenue share of that, I can actually produce, sell, and monetize my content directly from me. And I really like that. So I think to anybody who is, an emerging designer or somebody who is, self-funded or a small brand or a startup. I mean, let's put it this way. We work with some really large companies, people like Amazon and Google. They consider Slack a startup. Like, they consider, like Telegram a startup. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they consider apps that we have on our phone startups, but if you're a company that isn't making $100 million a year profit, in the grand scheme of things, you're a startup. I'm definitely a startup. So I'll say that, I'm part of that crew, right? So I think anybody without these extensive resources still has access to all of this technology. The great part about it is it's accessible to anybody. I mean, you or I, after this call, can go on Lens Studio for Snapchat, Maker's House, or whatever they're calling it now, for TikTok, or Spark AR for Instagram, and make an AR filter from your bedroom right now. They even have templates and things. I highly recommend everybody go try it out. You don't necessarily need a background in 3D design to use these tools. You just need a computer and access to the internet. Similarly, with anything to the extent of 3D development, also consider, especially when we're looking at young people today, how many young people, and by that I mean people like teenagers or people like just starting university, how many people within that category are at some level competent at either 3D development, Photoshop, building assets in something like Roblox. I think the answer would really surprise you. And if you look at your immediate circle today, especially if you're a young person, especially if you're in high school or undergrad, if you look at your immediate circle and see who can do what, I think you'd be so surprised how you have one friend who is an Instagram influencer and can maybe help you promote something, how you have one friend who is obsessed with Roblox and actually can build homes in virtual spaces. Like you wouldn't think that just knowing that your 12-year-old cousin spends 10 hours a day in Roblox, but some of them can actually build an experience. And guess what? Brands like Burberry would pay $50,000 to $100,000 for an experience like that to be built. So I think it's just like moving beyond the expectation that this is only for big brands. Those big brands still have to come to somebody to help them with these things. So I very, very much encourage anybody who is not at that level to experiment with this tech, because even though you see a lot of this on social media, the amount of people that actually understand any of this on a deep level is a very, very small group of people. I mean, I go to all these conferences all over the world. It's the same people. I'll go to Singapore, and then I'll go to Paris, and I'll go to LA, and then I'll go to, Toronto. And, 4 out of 5 people on my panel might be the same. Like, it's really crazy. But I'm saying that not to discourage people from breaking into this group of people. I am saying that to highly encourage anybody who is interested in new tech or creative development in a new context to explore this world, which, to the same point of my whole spiel about hypermodernity, is also, while it's going to seem more technical and more out there, it's also going to become more accessible and more attainable and more democratic to, start figuring it out and using it. I mean, I always mention this, but Blender, which is the main 3D software that most 3D artists use or start with, is free, and they have 150 free tutorials on their YouTube. You don't even have to go to school. You can just sit in your bedroom for 5 hours a day and do a university level course on Blender. And if you watch all those 150 videos, you can get hired for about $100 to $500 an hour. I'll leave it at that.
That's incredible. That's insane. I'll ask the next question just because I wanted to give you an opportunity to touch more on the 3D assets and the 3D glasses and the fact that we're making this leap from, rotary phone, landline phone, portable phone. And it's true that you mentioned this new idea and I've seen memes about it, but even you said that and I was like, oh yeah, that's a thing that's coming, but I don't even know about it. And I'm curious how that relates to fashion and how we're going to, I guess, consume fashion and media if we're watching our phones on our eyes, but then still able to walk around the street. Like, is that where we're at?
I'd say that is to a certain extent where we're at. I don't think it's necessarily where we're going, but it's in the right direction. I love your analogy of having iPhone strapped to your face, not because I necessarily agree with it, but I feel like that's how a lot of people feel in terms of when they look at this, that's what they see. And also I think, the current Apple Vision Pro headset is being marketed as a spatial computing device, as is the Meta's Quest 3. But what does that even mean, right? They're marketing this as a spatial computing device because the industry term for what they're talking about is either XR, extended reality, or MR, mixed reality, which kind of make a little bit more sense when you already consider that we all know what augmented reality, AR, and virtual reality, VR, are. But they're trying to move away conceptually from that whole category of tech, right? Because there is a bit of a negative perception towards AR, and there is a bit of a negative perception towards VR. The actual reality of the matter, and some people will hate me for saying this, but a lot of people have said it already, the current Apple Vision Pro headset is a VR headset, but it's a VR headset that has added an element of see-through capability. So the image of what you actually see on your Vision Pro isn't what's around you. It's a representation of what's around you. So it's like 99% accurate, but it's being refreshed like a video game at like 90 frames per second. So to a certain extent, yes, you are right. This is like a couple screens strapped to your face, but with a lot more technology involved. I think that the more exciting part of what currently exists and where this is going is the idea that we're moving from a device-centric internet experience or a device-centric digital world experience, right? Like if you want to play a video game, if you want to text your friend, if you want to go on social media, you have to do it through something, right? You have to pick up a phone, click it, you're staring at a screen. It's a physical, tangible set of actions that you have to do. We're moving away from that towards, using Apple's word, because it is a good word, a spatial environment where we are interacting with the world around us directly with an added layer of augmented, virtual, mixed, whatever you want to call it, reality. So we're taking the physical world around us and we're considering where would a digital interface or where would a digital experience add to my otherwise IRL experience? So then you start thinking, a little bit more pragmatically and a little bit beyond, just having a floating YouTube video next to you when you're walking down the street. You start thinking like, oh, I'm holding this glass of whatever, it's water, but pretend it's juice. How many calories are in this glass of orange juice? Tap comes up next to it and you can read that information. Walking down the street and, getting a little alert next to you saying that a car is coming. When you're performing a surgery, having, enlarged elements and things being labeled and, help, like it's adding another layer of support onto our experience of reality. And that sounds very scary and it sounds very conceptual to a certain degree, but it also sounds great when you consider, especially the often, kind of overlooked view that like, oh, technology is ruining kids. Like, they don't go outside anymore. Oh God. Like, I feel like we're almost like, that's kind of been given up over the past couple of years, since COVID, but it still is the conversation that's been had, from the naysayers of, tech development or whatever you want to call it, especially when you consider gaming. But when we start to consider that we're moving away from a space that is heads down in a device and moving towards an experience of that same content that is heads up, immersed in the world, I actually see that as extremely net positive. And then when we start to consider things like fashion, which is obviously the purpose of today's conversation, we have to remember that we only all wear clothes because we're looking at each other. If we all lived in an embryonic bubble, floating in space, I don't think we'd need to wear clothes. If we could somehow like telepathically just interact with each other, we wouldn't necessarily need to wear clothes. But if the way that we're interacting in that physical space is augmented by a layer of technology, inherently, every aspect of our lives is going to have to transform to meet that reality. So when you ask, how is fashion going to adapt to this virtual space? While many brands have already spent a lot of time, money, and R&D, research and development, in building out AR experiences, AR mirrors, like I said, some brands have thousands of assets digitized within a virtual space, watch brands, jewelry brands, etc. They are building towards a future where they're not just using that 3D asset in an advertisement. They're using it as your actual representation of that garment in real life, in terms of how people will witness it. It will be a digital representation of that garment. So it's moving beyond, and it's also considering things beyond a physical garment. If I'm looking at you, why couldn't you be wearing wings? Why couldn't why couldn't you have, a halo following you around? Like, anything that's technically currently impossible could, with this added layer of the internet, be at least visually possible. So I think it really opens up the doors, and we're going to see so many people play with this to the same extent that you see people truly expressing themselves in video games. I mean, how often do you see screenshots or, playable moments online of people with wings and they're on fire and they're, in these extravagant outfits that are physically impossible? That element of reality is going to start entering our tangible reality. So there's a lot to think about, and it's really a large conversation. But I think ultimately, what's exciting is we're moving away from this version of the world that many people have an issue with, in terms of, we're being taken away right now from society. Let's say, we're being coaxed into these walled gardens owned by Facebook, where we don't own any of our data. We don't have access to any of our data. They can sell it to anybody for any price, and we get nothing out of that. But when we start to own and take ownership over our immediate environments, especially within the digital realm, and, my persona is stored, and I own it, and there's proof of that online, and, I'm representing myself the way that I want to be represented, not how a brand wants to represent me. That's when we're starting to move towards a future that I'm personally really excited about, and that I can vouch for, instead of this dystopian world where everybody's going to have, iPhones strapped to their face and they're never going to look outside of this bubble. I'm waiting for Google to release their next version of their AR glasses, because the last version just had a tiny little chip in your glasses, just a little added field of vision. And that's not intrusive. That doesn't take me away from my physical environment. It adds to my physical environment. And that's how I want people to see technology, as something that'll add to your life, not take away from it.
There's such a huge divide. There are these people who are pro technology, pro AI, metaverse, and then there's these people who are obviously opposing it. It's like when the internet first came, there were people who were against it, and now it's hard to survive without it, right?
The internet is actually the best analogy because it's funny. It's funny to think about it this way, but I'm experiencing it very much firsthand. Most people who run anything called an innovation agency today probably had something called an internet studio or a web studio or a web development studio in the 90s or early 2000s. They just continue to work with new technologies. Honestly, most of them AI as well, even in the early 2000s, and continue to grow their product offerings and, kind of host this larger idea of what we consider the web or the internet or virtual space. So
yeah, and now there's way too much money involved in metaverse or Web3 that we can't
never
really
too much.
Now there's too much of it. We can't go back.
Never too much. We'll take more.
I bet there's more coming. So I think this is a great segue into my last question as well. And it's a great way to end the episode. Where do you think in 10 years, maybe 20 years or 30 years is the future of technology? Where are we headed in terms of the technology and fashion specifically? And my question is kind of twofold. What can consumers expect, and what can startups like you or even smaller startups expect to catch on or catch up to the trend? Or obviously nobody wants to miss out, and the world is, or venture capitalists, or everybody's moving towards making investments only in the kind of projects that are actually getting involved in AI or metaverse. So what do you think can startups expect, or how do they catch on to this trend, or not miss out on any opportunities like these, and as well as for consumers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially nowadays, there is an onus on brands and individuals alike to, be their own, media company, trend forecasting agency, insert all of the, social media agency, insert all of these different, descriptions here, just because we live in such a connected age. But that being said, I think it's more on the brands and on the consumers to just keep tabs on what's happening in the world, and more so what's relevant to them. Because as we talked about today, as technology continues to develop, there's going to be too many different disparate, touch points for somebody to be, locked into all of them. Let's say, a brand is not going to start making cars and then also start making, luxury hoodies, unless you're Tesla. Obviously, there's some exceptions. But generally speaking, you're not going to mix two things that are completely from disparate worlds. That being said, I think the other part of your question that I would maybe amend, not because it's wrong in any way, but just because of the ways of the world today, is when we look at the future, previously we would consider that as like 20 years, 50 years ahead of where we are today. When we're thinking about the future, especially of technology, in a way that we could actually understand speaking to each other, I think we're actually now looking at more like 2 years into the future, maybe 3 years into the future. I actually personally find it very difficult to predict what 10 years in the future might look like. I can hypothesize, and I can give you, wild statements and thoughts about how I think that, maybe we'll never die, and, our consciousnesses will be uploaded to the cloud. But, that's very, far reaching right now for thinking about something like that. I can more accurately predict what I think the next 2 years are going to look like, which I did 2 years ago and was correct. So I can't say I have the longest track record, but at least in the past, couple of years, so far so good. What I am experiencing working with brands on the big brand level and on the startup level is, we really are moving towards this spatial internet. So you can see it in terms of a natural progression of technologies. We're moving from TV and video games to smaller, more, and then desktop computers, laptop computers, more personalized, iPhones and iPads, more personalized, to something that's hyper personalized and actually an addition to your experience of the world. Like, I think many of us would say that our phones are, integral to our experience of the world, but this will actually be physically or tangibly, integral to your experience of the world. So I think as technology continues to move forwards, we're going to see a lot of problems solved, if we're thinking, positively as well. I like to think about this on a positive vein of thought. We're going to see a lot of problems solved across industries by technology, from, loss of life to extending life to, potentially preserving life. We're going to see medical innovations come into play that will transform people forever. But we're going to see this across the board, really. So I think that when we're looking at the future of technology, we should really just look at the technologies that are influencing society today and try to think like, what would this look like in 2 to 5 years max if this continues to move forward successfully? So when we're looking at something like AI, I mean, the sky's the limit, right? You know, if we're already at a point today where by the end of this year, about 74% of the internet will be written by AI, by I think they said about December of 2024. So if we're considering that, what will the internet look like in more than 2 years? I don't think I can tell you, but I can tell you by those numbers, you know, most content in virtual spaces will probably be automatically generated, which has a whole bunch of different things that you can consider, you know, a whole bunch of facts that come up when you consider that, from who is going to be prompting that content, who is the content going to be written about, what will be relevant to people versus machines to write about. And then also you're going to be heralding in what I think is going to be the next era of Web3 or blockchain integration, et cetera, because when everything is written by a machine, how do we know what's written by a human? The only way that that's possible, and this is something that I really do believe in, is proving humanity. And the only way to do that right now in the era of the internet is through an on-chain, on the blockchain transaction. You can have something tied to your wallet as a soul-bound token that you can never transfer or have leave your wallet. You know, you can have proof of humanity within digital spaces. So I really do believe in the next few years, all of these conversations that we've been having around all of these different nascent technologies are going to start to merge together and actually start to make sense together. Because right now, as we spoke about, there are a lot of disparate things being developed simultaneously. But really, in the future, all of these things will come together cohesively and will be experienced through the device that will be attached to our face. So I think that you know, there's a lot to unpack there, but that's my my high level. More spatial computing, way more AI to a borderline scary extent. And blockchain will make a comeback as a solution to AI.
You said prove humanity, and I heard my ancestors in the background going, "Oh hell no!" Like no, but I'm very down with this, and I want to thank you so much, David, for such an amazing, comprehensive conversation. I feel like I could learn so much from you, and I'm very excited that you're coming out with a book because I'm going to need it to study. I think the next 2 years that are coming. If anyone listening or watching would like to learn more about you, about Cash Labs and the amazing work that you're doing, I'm putting you a bit on the spot, but I bet you know it like the back of your hand. Where would anybody listening go to learn more about you?
Yes, absolutely. You can find me personally on any social media at DavidCash888. You can also find out more about Cash Labs on our website at cashlabs.io, or on Instagram at cashlabs.io as well, or on Twitter at cashlabs_. We haven't gotten the cohesive domain yet. We're working on it, so it'll come soon.
Thank you again, David, for coming and for this insightful discussion. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe for the next one in the series, leave a comment, and share with others.
Until next time, stay fashionable.